Hi, I'm Yinka, and this is The Hurt Locker, a podcast where we open a door into men's mental health. Come and go. Susie, welcome back to The Hurt Locker.
One of my favourite places to be and one of my favourite company to be in with you.
And I'd like to talk more about the work that you've been doing.
At what age does society decide that the boy, worthy of love, care and protection, is now a man and no longer deserving of any?
But men are supposed to be islands once they reach 13, 14, 15, stand on their own 2 feet.
You listen to men tell you that their lives are on fire. And then I've got to go into a room and politely ask people with power and money and influence for a fire engine. And
You're listening to The Hurt Locker, the podcast that opens the door on men's mental health. And back again, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Susie Bennett. Susie, welcome back to The Hurt Locker.
One of my favourite places to be and one of my favourite company to be in with you. So very happy to be here.
Thank you. When we started off with The Hurt Locker, you were episode 26. That was a year and a half ago, you know, just before World Suicide Day as well. And I was listening to what we spoke about then. And I'd like to talk more about the work that you've been doing. But before we start on that, I'm just going to dive in with you. And this is from heartfelt, genuine. How are you?
Bless you. It's always such a challenging question to reflect on because aspects of me are brilliant and aspects of me are really stressed and worried and uncertain and struggling. So, you know, it's one of the things that's best for me for my mental health has been doing this work. And I think that doing this work brings you into deep connection with people, you know, because it's a topic that and I have no judgment about this, not everybody has the stomach to be in it. And you don't necessarily have to be here if it's not your experience either, but if it is your experience, or if you are somebody that can sort of be in that conversation, you know, it's such a profound, intimate exchange that then happens between people who are questioning or struggling to, you know, stay in existence. And I feel that a real strength of community can grow around kind of some of the darkest feelings that it is for a human being to feel. So there's all these kind of contrasts and, you know, light and shade to the work. So even when I'm sort of personally struggling, when I'm in front of the work and doing the work or in conversation with people like you, like these are great things for my mental health in terms of feeling a tremendous sense of kind of purpose and, you know, kind of moral hunger to contribute to an awful situation being improved in some way. And how are you?
I am good. I'll share something maybe later on. I am good.
Okay.
The reason why I asked you is because I was thinking about the work that you do. I was thinking about, and I'd like you to expand on what you've been doing. But I was thinking about how you find yourself in this sphere, in this area, being a woman as well, what that means, and also the potential toil that it has on you and how are you able to manage to cope with that?
Yeah.
And so for me, for somebody who I see as such a beautiful human being, a beautiful spirit, somebody who's so delicate and fragile, I care about you. So I'm just putting that out there.
Inka, I adore you, and I think we energetically responded to each other from the moment that we met. Like something in my spirit, I think, accords really deeply with you, and thank you for saying that, and for your care, which I really feel and appreciate. And I think that's kind of in answer to your question about being a woman doing this work, is that one, you always want to tread lightly in the sense that it's not my experience. I'm somebody who's experienced thoughts and feelings of suicide. I know what I've tasted that distress, and I live with the concern that that distress may erupt to me again. So I understand that feeling, but of course I do not understand what it is to move as a man in the world. I think as a woman doing this work, it's brought me, Yinka, not just into a much richer understanding of the male experience, which I really, really, I look back on who I was before I started this journey, and there were so many things I just did not understand. I just did not understand them. And I think like having the space to really listen and learn has brought me into that much deeper understanding. And that brings me into a much deeper connection with the men that I meet. And it also, as a woman, means that I become the recipient of a lot of care from men as well. And I think it made me really kind of realize on a personal level the energetic incompleteness of that we're experiencing as human beings because of this kind of conversation about this battle of the sexes, as it were, putting it in a very crude way.
Yes.
That that men can only prosper at the detriment of women, and vice versa, and that we're somehow kind of at war with one another, and it cuts us off energetically from that kind of deep intimacy, which I think, Yinka, going back evolutionary wise, to when we back into our history, when when our survival was so dependent on one another. And I think that I think that our ancestors would find it so, or I like to imagine that they would find it so strange and so sad that we have this kind of divide between us at times. But and just to go to in terms of the things that I find difficult about the work, for me, it's not the emotional side of it. I mean, of course, because sometimes I worry so deeply about men I'm in contact with, as I'm sure you do in your work. There's certain, of course, you come into this from driven by care, and so and so that care doesn't stop when you sort of close your laptop or end your conversation. So there is an emotional strain sometimes that you carry. But the thing that I find actually hardest about the work is the stuff around it. So the worrying about money, worrying about funding, being in rooms where you feel like, I said to someone the other day, like, through the work that you do, you're listening to people listening to men tell you that their lives are on fire. And then I've got to go into a room and politely ask people with power and money and influence for a fire engine. And I sometimes find it difficult to be calm in those moments, because I want more to be happening quicker than it is and at a bigger scale. And those are the sides of the work that I find kind of challenging. But there's an underbelly of so many beautiful things that are happening. And like, I think of where you are and in Liverpool, and the work that you're doing, the work of organizations like Sean's Place, and like that's just, it's so beautiful and precious. James's Place, I think it's Martin Gallia project, and there's a Paul Levine, I think that's an end of domestic abuse charity for men. All of this stuff happening just in Liverpool, like, and surrounding areas. So there's this underbelly of change and hope and community kind of driven action that I find really it's a drug in my veins, I have to say. It gives me so much hope and courage.
That's good. And we'll touch on that hope and courage later on. But for the benefit of people who don't know you and your work, shame on yous. It was Dr. Susie Bennett, and what have you been researching?
So I did my first study in 2018 into this question of suicide in men. So for the benefit of the listeners that might not know, basically in almost every country in the world, we see this pattern of men dying at higher rates of suicide than women. So geographically, we see that situation in almost every country. And historically, looking back, when we look back at the records in the UK, for example, of suicide statistics, they started being recorded in 1861. And for every single year, Yinka, since then, every single year, there've been more male deaths recorded. So there's this very clear, for me, very clear question when it comes to the behavior of suicide. That is what is it about the male experience? What is it about being a man that might be elevating risk for men? And then we have this very strange situation where there just hasn't been the research output to really get underneath the skin of that question. So, like I said, I did my first study in it in 2018, and it was that study was completely turned my life upside down, because those conversations that I had with, it was men that had either attempted suicide or thought about suicide, and loved ones who'd lost a man to suicide. Those conversations just kind of turned my world upside down. And I described it once as like, it was like dialing into a radio station and suddenly hearing this frequency of male pain that I'd never really heard before in my life. And it was like once I dialed into that radio station, I couldn't stop hearing it.
Absolutely.
And so, that work has sort of carried on since then. And more recently, the focus, I would say the last kind of 18 months has been, in terms of research, as you know, I try to do a lot of kind of knowledge sharing events, because for me,
yes,
it's the knowledge belongs to the people. As a research, you have a huge kind of responsibility, I think, especially with a topic like this, which is of paramount kind of public interest and public concern, that you are sharing what you find back with people. But in terms of research since we last spoke, I've really been focused on looking at the role of childhood experiences and how the things that happen in childhood and early life can create a kind of fault line of distress, underneath a person's life, and, potentially amplify suicide risk across the life course. And that Yink has been really like emotional work at times, really emotional to
imagine. We'll touch on that in a minute if you don't mind. But you were collaborating with Man Up as well, so you were doing all the workshops. I attended a few in London, etc., locally in that, and they've resonated with me. And some of the speakers as well, locally as well. It's been good to see their involvement. Where are we up to with that? Because I believe that collaboration's ended now.
Yeah, so they were Man Up were an amazing partner. They're a men's mental health charity, and they gave me funding for over 2 years. They gave me annual funding for the last 2 years to kind of carry on my research. And then also we were doing these knowledge sharing events. I think we went to Cardiff, Glasgow, Liverpool, Newcastle, Manchester, London, Ipswich. And it was amazing, Igor. So at these events, I'm sharing the work, but then I always try and find local people who are doing community work, often with lived experience themselves, to kind of share about their stories and the work that they're doing. Because, like I say, there's some phenomenal stuff that's happening. And so, yeah, that funding ended last month, and I've now registered a charity called Action on Male Suicide. So it literally
Go on.
kind of says what it does on the.
So tell us about that
Yeah.
charity then.
Yeah, so the purpose of that is going to be, it's like research evidence action. So it's about funding research. We can't, if there's a problem in the world, in order to understand it, you've got to go and talk to the people experiencing it to understand what they need to make things different, to change things. So for me, research is so, so, so important. That dialogue with men to understand what it is that they need. At the same time, Yinka, respecting that men are so diverse. Like I'm in this work, I encounter all kinds of different men living all kinds of different lives with all different kinds of needs. And so it's about properly researching what those are, and then taking that research, that evidence-based, and turning it into action. Okay, what we going to do then to improve services, to improve training for professionals, to strengthen community support, so practical things like that. But then there's also all these groups that we're so behind in terms of male suicide research. There's all these groups of men that we still know very, very little about, that are going to have specific kinds of risk factors. The men that are sort of particularly sort of front and present in my mind at the moment are men with disabilities, who I think are 3 or 4 times higher suicide rates. And there's been very, very little research into, understanding why. So what I want to do, Yinka, is create, is to put a flag in the sand, as it were. I just say, for everybody that cares about this issue and wants to see real, deep, sustainable change start to, happen about it, this is where we can gather and to start kind of pushing forward together. For me, Yinka, this work belongs to the people. There's so many people up and down the country and around the world that have a personal connection to this issue and a deep, I think, desire to see things start to happen. I cannot keep talking about all the things that are wrong.
Absolutely. But the interesting thing for me was a couple of things. You quote 1863, that's when we first started recording, suicides, even though we've known since, the turn of the 1800s about suicides, or we've been able to categorize what it is. And yet, in spite of all the organizations, peer support groups, blah, 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 that are out there, we're still seeing that rise in suicides. And the ONS, even this year, quoted was 7,147. That's an increase from last year of deaths by suicide. So imagine if we weren't doing anything. God knows what the figures would be like.
Yeah.
We're doing all this, and it feels like we're still standing still until we have some drivers that come in and say, no, we're going to take this seriously now, because I'll still maintain it's not being taken seriously enough.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, Yinka. And that's the thing. That's I think, I describe it at those knowledge sharing events. It's like the elephant in the room.
Yes.
I don't know how we can. I don't. For me, it's such a reflection on our societies. Deaths of despair, the conditions that we've said this is acceptable for us to live in as human beings. And I think that all of this for me runs so, so deep in the way that our societies and cultures and communities are kind of structured, and a kind of disconnection from core needs. But I describe it as it's a splinter in the soul of our societies.
Brilliant. The question I was going to ask you was, what drives society, and is society leading humanity, as it were? Because there seems to be a divergence of what we seek to, what's optimal, how we should live our lives, what should be the great things in terms of achieving, wealth, this, that, and the other. But in reality,
Mm.
what do we as human beings
Yeah,
truly need and value?
yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know, and there's definitely a dissonance between the two, but
Yeah.
nobody's saying, let's pull up now. We've gone too far one way. We need to just take stock.
I couldn't agree with you more. I describe it as, and I say this sort of respectfully as somebody who identifies as what I'm about to describe, but it, I remember as a kid learning about when people used to work in the mines and they would send the canaries down. And when the
Yes.
canaries stopped singing, they died because the air was kind of so, and people knew then that the air was bad for them to be breathing. And that's how I think about people who are suicidal, those canaries. They are signaling back to the people behind, to society, that the air that we are breathing, by that I mean the values in which we've imbued our modern lives, they're not safe for our well-being to some extent. Some of them, obviously, there's great things about the modern world, but there's things that are so, at odds to the
Yes.
things that we need to be psychologically well. And I think
Yes.
for me, it's not for me that suicidal people are over there kind of separate and something different to the rest of society. They're an extension of the ways in which and the conditions in which we're living. And for me, that is, they are a mirror signaling back to us. And the other thing, Yinka, to say is that for me, one of the most powerful things about this work and the conversations that I have is that when I speak to men who are suicidal, they are reminding me all of the time of the things that make life meaningful, because the things that they are yearning for, the things that they are living without, that they cannot bear to be living without because it makes life feel so awful, are the things that make life meaningful. There are anchors to life. And when I speak to men, it's not, they're not saying, I wish I had more money, I wish I was
No.
wealthier, I wish I had this bigger, better car or this fancier car. They want connection, purpose, belonging, to feel like they matter, to feel like there's somebody of value in the world. And so you're reminded all of the time of like those core, kind of principles. At the same time, I don't do, of course, in our modern worlds, we need a certain amount of financial well-being. When you're worried about money every day,
You can't focus
it's
on anything else. Absolutely.
fucking horrendous. Yeah. So,
Absolutely.
beyond that well-being, financial well-being, the way that money is, I really feel for men. And I think in terms of that, when I watched kind of like the Manosphere
Yes.
documentary and
Yeah.
the way the emphasis that is being fed to so many young men about their value as a human being coming from their economic position. I think when I do my knowledge sharing events, I share that quote. So you would have heard this already, but it was from a study in Brazil where a man said, he was describing the circumstances leading up to his attempt. And he said, I tried to start a business for my family and it didn't
Yes.
work. So he says there was no other alternative except killing myself.
Absolutely.
And for me, the idea that his only sense of himself, his only sense of his value to his family is as
Is
economic value.
is monetary. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And
Absolutely.
if I cannot fulfill that, I have no other I've no emotional value to them, no relational value to them. And therefore, if I haven't succeeded in that economic domain, there's no other alternative for me except killing myself. Now, of course, other things will be going on in his life, but the fact that that's how he articulated it and saw his circumstances for himself, that is brutal.
I think you
I think what
describe it as violence. You
it's a
describe it as
cultural
violence.
violence. Yeah,
It is. It is.
yeah.
And just going back to the canary, and
Mm,
I use that as a metaphor, but what I'm hearing reading between the lines is that we need a Humphrey Davy lamp, as it were, because he was the guy who could sniff out. He designed the lamp.
okay. Yeah.
after the canary died, but in the mind.
Yeah.
So we need that some type of device which says this air that we're breathing is toxic for us all. We cannot
Yeah.
survive in this. We need to switch
Mm.
it up in some way,
Mhm.
shape, or form.
Mm.
And you know, and that's why I asked the question about what drives society. And I was thinking about that as a question before us because we look at the structures of men and how they're supposed to be, etc. What if really all I wanted to do when I was a child and as I've grown up was just to be an artist,
Mm.
just to be an artist? I didn't have to
Mm.
become, you know, a successful artist, but what if my life and what I valued to be true
Mm.
and honest to me was to just paint art, paint
Mm.
pictures? Why couldn't that just be acceptable?
Mm.
But society would look at that and say, no, you've got to provide for your family, you've got to make money, you've got to do X, Y, and Z. And it's like,
Mm.
really?
Mm.
Really? And I think that what we're doing, we're stripping away people's dreams and
Mm.
aspirations and trying to shoehorn them into boxes that they don't fit into.
Yeah, and boxes that constrain kind of the fullness of their humanity. So I remember speaking to another guy who said similar to what you're saying, but in a different way about all he ever wanted was to be a stay-at-home dad. That's what what he wanted was just to be full-time, parent, and that was, he felt like he would struggle to meet a partner that would see that as as attractive. That was what his kind of like internalized, idea was, and this Yinka is where again as a woman doing this work, it's so interesting then for me to learn and to understand because I've not had those same pressures, I don't think, of feeling like, of course, I love to, I'm a protector and a provider, absolutely. I love to do that. But for example, I don't have an income at the moment, and that, it's stressful, but I don't feel it's corrosive of my identity in the same way that
Yes.
I think for a man it can be really, undermining of sort of identity.
I think, just on that point as well, I remember back in 2010, I was unemployed for a brief period of time and I applied for all types of jobs. And I realized I was going through a process whereby I was defining who I was by my job role, by my
Mm,
job title, and the fact that I did not have a job in one instance looked as if I had no value in society,
mm, mm,
because you can
mm,
feel it may be invisible, but you can feel the constraints, the pressures of and expectations of what society expects from you,
mm,
be an
mm,
earner, to be a provider.
mm, mm. And then even within that, Yinka, I feel like there can be a hierarchy of what is most valuable. So I remember having a really interesting conversation recently with an electrician who was saying that his idea of what a proper man was a man in a suit, which I found so fascinating and illuminating to me that were, because obviously that's not who he is every day in his
Absolutely.
work. And I thought, wow, there's all these nuances to it.
Well, it's funny you should say that. I had a client last week. He's just got a new job, and in preparation for his new job, he had his interview, and he will dress down. But what he noticed when he put a shirt and tie on was that
Mm,
people who may see him as a threat were acknowledging him because he had a shirt and tie on.
yeah.
And it was like, and I said to him, there's some research that can be done into that because primarily it was white males of a particular age who were acknowledging
Mm,
him and not seeing him as a threat, as if he was
mm,
stepping up, he was conforming,
mm,
he was in how he should
mm,
be society,
mm.
and again, yeah, a man in a suit. That's so interesting.
Mm,
There was something, it got mentioned when you were in Liverpool, and I think you mentioned it before. And we spoke about vulnerability, but specifically the thing that I want to touch upon is touch and connection. And there's a
mm,
quote you mentioned about a boy, well, a man at 29, he'd been experiencing suicidal thoughts since the age of 13 every 3 days. And the
mm.
quote he mentions is that at what age does the body society that is deemed, come on, you know it,
Yeah.
you say
He
it
said,
better than
yeah,
me.
yes. So he says, at what age does society decide that the boy, worthy of love, care, and protection, is now a man and no longer deserving of any? And I think, I mean, all the time you go, I'm hearing stuff that is kind of like a electric shock to my brain of kind of connecting things, and but that sentence in particular, really haunted me. It haunted me, Yinka, because I'm somebody that's, I came into this work as somebody who has I came into it someone who felt a deep love for men, and for the men in my life, and the men that have shaped me, and the men that I wouldn't be sat here without them. And I think when I read that quote, it instantly resonated. There was instantly a part of me that went, yeah, there's there's something so powerful in this, and also of shame that can be true.
Okay, okay, so if I run with the shame aspect of it, that point of love, care, and protection, it kind of
Mm,
ceases for a young man at the age of 13, 14. You know, it's like women, girls, they can have that
mm,
love, that care, and protection, and they can have that all throughout life. But men are supposed to be islands once they reach 13, 14, 15, stand on their own 2 feet. But not all men are the same. A lot
mm,
of men still need that love, that care, that protection, that hug, that touch, that connection.
yeah,
But we're told that, oh no, you're a wuss if you need all of that.
right,
No, no,
yeah,
we need it. We need
yeah.
it.
Humans need it. They need it. I mean, it's literally, we're not being hyperbolic or dramatic. It's just, you need it. It's as simple as that. You need it. And to be denied, to be told that you don't, and denied your access to fulfilling that need. For me, this is why I talk about cultural violence, because it's a psychological need that you have as a human being. And for you to be denied fulfilling that need because you've been told these cultural ideas that we've all absorbed and internalized and are all, to some extent contributing to perpetuating, that's now putting a barrier between you and accessing that need. That for me it's a cultural violence, and I see the brutal, consequences of it all of the time. And there
Do
has to
you?
be, sorry, there has to be a social reckoning. There
Okay.
has to be a social reckoning in terms of that we as a people creating society and communities and families and workplaces have to acknowledge the empathy gap that man so
Yes.
beautifully articulated. Because I challenge
Yes.
anyone listening, irrespective of their gender, I challenge anyone listening to think about a young girl in distress and feel what happens to you in your body in terms of your emotional response to that. Think about a woman in distress, and again, be mindful of what happens in your body. And then think about a young boy, and then think about a man in distress. And I would say that most people listening to that, irrespective of their gender, will find that something shifts in their compassion when they think about a young boy in distress versus a man in distress, that doesn't happen to the same extent when thinking about a
Yes.
young girl in distress and a woman in distress. And that for me is a crystallization in a way of this empathy gap. And that is it's not it's just not okay. It's not
It's not.
okay. And I know it comes from complicated, lots of trauma for lots of different people involved in this kind of conversation. But that is the social reckoning that I'm talking about, of us acknowledging that that is happening, that empathy gap is happening, and what are we going to do about that?
Would you say the start of that empathy gap was the industrialization, industrial revolution?
I mean, there's been some people that have written some really interesting things about that, which I find fascinating. And this idea that with the Industrial Revolution and these bigger, more kind of brutal wars, certainly in terms of the weapons that were there of mass destruction were then available, an industry that basically involved, you have to risk, in certain industries, you have to risk your life every day
Yes.
to go and
Yes.
do them. To go and fight in historical wars of the past, you have to risk your life to go and do that. And therefore, there's these thinkers that have kind of described how if you've got to risk your life for work or war, being told to suppress your emotions, just suppress your fears, to hide your pain is a good strategy, because it probably makes those scenarios in that moment easier to cope with. But of course, we're all then prospering. The society is prospering from you suppressing your
100%.
emotions and going
100%.
and carrying industry or fighting in our wars. And so there's a culpability. For me, that's a very, 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 very interesting idea. And the historical, emotional, social, psychological, human cost that's been born by people because of those ideas.
I think for me, that empathy gap, we can look at industrialization and the pursuit of conquest, the pursuit of success, the pursuit of anything which supposedly elevates us, but to the detriment of humanity. At any cost, we will achieve X, Y, and Z. Tim just put in there, only women, children, and dogs are loved unconditionally. A man is only loved under the conditions that he provides. Chris Rock, 2007. And it's funny, I think sometimes there's a few things that are going on in my head now. If I speak personally, I think sometimes, and I'm going to link it back to another question now, but I think sometimes, would I have, as a child, wanted to have been hugged, kissed, told that I was loved? You better believe it. Did I get any of that? If I'm being honest with you, no.
Yeah.
No. And and I spoke last time about all I knew growing up before I left home and when I left home, etc., was violence. That the only way to prove that I was a man was through fighting, And I had to prove that I wasn't going to be taken the piss out of. And that's a false construct. And so many men have to bear that on a daily basis. And that's what leads to this, I think, partly to this despair. And the question I was going to ask you, and you've alluded to it, is the role of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, in suicide. And I don't know, is something that you're going to be looking at explicitly?
Yeah. I think just on the point you just made, I think so much about where are the spaces in men's life to receive tenderness, and I think that when I came and saw you in Liverpool, I had the knowledge sharing event. At the end of the event, I went with Debbie to visit Sean's Place, which is a community organization set up in memory of Debbie's brother Sean, who died by suicide. And it's now a space where they've got all kinds of stuff happening for men. Incredible, beautiful stuff. And the evening that I went, we arrived at the center and Debbie was showing me around, and in the central kind of hall, all the lights were off. They were kind of like just some ambient lighting, these beautiful sounds, these gongs, and all these men lying down on mats having this sound bath. And it was, Yinka, it was such a tender, tender moment. And I thought, I would be so curious to know when is the last time that the men accessing that moment had that kind of space to
just be.
Yeah, to set everything down and just be tenderly held in a energetically, at least, in a moment like that. And I thought it was so, you know, so moving. And I think, sorry to go off on one a bit, but I
No,
remember as well, he was a young guy and he was having a lot of romantic challenges, and he was so deeply lonely for love, for romance, for connection, for intimacy, for tenderness. And he was basically saying it's so difficult to be able to express that without people immediately assuming, or his peers or the women around him immediately assuming that he was kind of an incel, or that he was somehow saying that he's entitled to sex and and that's not what he was trying to say at all. He was expressing a human need that I, as a woman, could relate to. I also have moments like that. I completely understand it. It's a human experience, a human need. And if you're not having that need met, of course, at times it can create a yearning and a pain. And not feeling that he was able to kind of be able to communicate or express that craving for tenderness was, it was really sobering for me, because I thought I can say those things as a woman and not have it kind of misread or misheard or misunderstood. And I think that's a really serious question about where men receive kind of that sort of tenderness and touch. I think is really, Yinka, I've got a a passion for like evolutionary stuff and human evolution. And there's a great researcher who goes to study the bonobos in DR Congo, who are, for those listening, are like our closest living relative, along with the common chimpanzees. And he films them, he just films, and you can watch kind of 20 minutes of, and I just sit and watch the bonobos all on this branch, just grooming each other. All of this touch that's happening to help, in some ways to socially regulate this group of, biological beings. And I think that's in us somehow, that, that's where we kind of came from. And now we live in really touch-starved
Absolutely.
societies. And that if you're a man of a certain age and you're not in a relationship,
you're fucked.
I don't know where
let's be honest about it.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna add some of my clients will maybe go with sex workers because of that, because they want that just close connection, because they're not in a relationship.
Yeah.
They find it difficult, and I know some part and parcel of your research has been looking at men's relationship with their own emotions, men's relationship with themselves, but also men's relationship with others. And it's like we're cut off in this chaotic world, 24/7 world. There's no space set aside to just be, to just even have a normal conversation. How are you doing? You know?
It's so unnatural for us, I think.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. This is what we're talking about. There's a correlation between, the death of people by suicide and what's occurring within society. And until you know, we can look at ACEs, but even when we drill down, we need to look at what structures are in place that cause ACEs to occur.
No, you're absolutely right, because ACEs don't they don't drop out of the sky and suddenly happen. Like, there's a context, and there are, all kinds of different factors. But yes, going back to the original question about ACEs. So this is adverse childhood experiences. So it's basically if you experience something in childhood or early life, that those experiences make you develop ways of coping that are not what we would think to be healthy ways of coping, but they
Yes.
help you to survive
Yes.
an environment that is, kind of unsafe. So, for example, there were men talking about learning from a very young age to suppress your emotions, because if you
Yes.
expressed your emotions at home, you were going to get smacked. And if you
Yes.
cried, you got smacked again. So you
Yes.
learned to suppress your emotions. Now, you could say that's a very good strategy in an unsafe environment like that. Learning to suppress your emotions was going to be a better potential survival strategy than continuing to express them, because the continuing to express them was going to be met with, more and more violence. The problem is that once you leave that unsafe environment and you enter into adulthood, if you don't update your coping strategies, you're still using the strategies that you learned in an unsafe environment, then it can be really impair then your ability to, to function. And
if you haven't got the emotional literacy to express or articulate what your background had been, and these are the behaviors that have contributed to it now, then if it makes the difficulties of being in relationships
yeah,
fruitful, blossoming, because you haven't got the capacity to articulate. I was fucking scared as a child, and this is
yes,
how I
yeah,
coped, you know?
yeah,
And every time I
yeah,
hear a noise or see somebody look at me a particular way, all I see is a threat. I'm big
yeah,
now, so I can look after myself. So if anybody looks at me like that, then I can look after myself.
yeah,
But we don't know when to switch that off.
yeah,
We haven't been taught or educated how to switch that off.
yeah. Exactly, to what you were saying earlier, Yinka, about your own experience of, like, you growing up and you grew up within violence, and so that's how you kind of learned that that's how you were expected to be, out in the world. And it's so, I have so much compassion and concern for those kids growing up in those unsafe environments. And I think it's really, really important when we think about childhood adversities in the context of men and boys, and we think about this double jeopardy in terms of how that environmental harm is potentially compounded by the cultural harm. So what you were saying about a young child who feels scared, that's awful for any kid. But what does it
Yeah.
mean for a boy specifically who's also being told you need to be, socially and culturally, you need to be a man?
Yes.
Where does all these boys in my data, or they're men now, but they were describing what happened to them as boys, all of them that experience painful events, and then they're being socialized in these, cultural norms of men need to suppress their pain. Where does that pain ever find meaningful release for them if they've just been told to, shove it down? So often, Yinka, I'll speak to a man and he'll go, my childhood was fine. It was good. And then through the conversation, he'll start to tell you a bit more about it. And in my head, I'm thinking, that
That
doesn't
was
sound,
not fine.
yeah, that
Absolutely.
doesn't sound okay. And yeah, and I think, and those are the things that you cannot, that when I meet you, Yinka, I have no idea about the world that you've come from, the pain that you may have known as a child, in the same way that you don't know for me. But those and unless we have the opportunity, which if you've had painful events in childhood, you really do need at some point in your life, I believe, the opportunity to process what has happened to you, to make sense
Yes.
of it and understand how it might be shaping you, as an adult. It can be such an enormous invisible backpack of bricks that you're
100%. I like that.
carrying through
Yeah.
carrying through life.
Funny because you mentioned about double jeopardy, but what about those boys to young men who then deviate from society and end up incarcerated? Then all it does is just reaffirms I'm not good enough, I'm a bad person, this, that, and the other. But nobody's looked at what happened to them.
Up to you, yeah.
No,
What are
what's
you
happened to
carrying?
them that, yeah, that's led them to this state. And
Yeah,
so you end up in the big house, as they call it, then that's you, 9 times out of 10, marked for life. And I
yeah.
don't, again, I've got my own views on what rehabilitation truly means, you know, but somebody going to jail and then that's not the end. That's not the end for them. There's a continuance of that.
Mm, mm.
And I don't know what we're teaching people. I don't know what we're learning as a society.
I couldn't agree more. And the things that we are allowing to happen on our watch to young people in terms of the stuff that can go on, not just at home, a lot of people in the studies that we looked at, they were loving people at home, but the stuff then that went on at school or in in their communities, or having an aspect of your identity that was socially kind of stigmatized. There's the thing that troubled me most. So we did one of these studies with it was 710 men who'd been suicidal in the last week or year. Their average age now was 30 years old, and 79% of them said that they first had thoughts of suicide or attempted suicide before teenage years or pre-teenage years. They were having thoughts of suicide or attempting suicide. Again, Yinka, when we talk about a splinter in the soul of our societies, when you've got groups of young people in our society who are at the start of their journey into adulthood, they've reached that line to start that passage into adulthood, and they're already thinking, they've already found life so painful that they've started to think about or made an attempt on their life,
Yes.
is something that, how can we, this thing you said, Jinka, something so powerful at the Liverpool event about the shoes. Do you remember?
Was this in relation to understanding about suicide or?
You were saying that if you did a stunt where you put just pairs of shoes on like the front of the government of all the people that had died in suicide in a year.
Yes. Of, yeah, I remember what I was saying. Yeah, because I effectively was saying, talking about, yeah, using it as a football analogy. If those
Yeah,
200 plus 18, 10 to 18-year-olds who die every year were coming back from a football match, who died by suicide
yeah,
were actually coming back from a football match, then there would be a governmental inquiry. There'd
yeah,
have to be.
into what's
There
happened.
would,
Yeah,
there would have to be. But we don't hear anything about that. We
yeah.
don't hear it. And so, and even when I deliver the training with the likes of Suicide Bereavement UK, I do ask the question, how seriously do we take suicide? And
Mm,
apparently, by government responses, not seriously enough. Something just popped into my mind now. Uh, Over the next few years, because of AI, the growth of AI, the government is looking to invest 1.6 billion, not solely into mental health, but utilizing AI to help
mm,
us move forward forward. My biggest concern is that we don't have people gaining access to just sit in front of you and I to say, I'm struggling. So how is AI going to help to decrease suicides? It's not. It's really, really not. But like, this is about society being driven by technology or whatever, or investors, and forgetting about
Yeah.
those who are quote unquote not strong enough to keep up,
Mm.
you know?
And and it also kind of outsources the problem. We can keep it over there without doing
Brilliant.
what you're talking about is a
Brilliant.
reflection of like what are we doing to contribute it as a government, your housing policy, your
100%. All those structural
workplace,
education.
yeah, all of it, all education, all of it is suicide prevention if you want it to be. And it should be if you're serious about suicide and and
I'm going to ask Tim to do this quick maths now. 1.67 million times by 7,147. Just do the maths on that, please. And I'll tell you for why. Put him on the spot now. 1.67 million times by 7,147. The reason why I mentioned the 1.67 million is because that's what the government attributes to one person's death by suicide in this country.
okay, the economic cost.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they say of that 1.67 million, 60% is borne by the bereaved. Go on. Come on, Tim. Where are you now? But the point is this. It's where the will is.
Yeah.
You shouldn't have to do the research. We, society, should say, this is not acceptable and this is what we're going to do about it. You know? Is that, Tim, I'm hoping that's 11,935,490,000. I think,
Billion, yeah.
yeah, 11 billion. So if we focused on, here's a radical idea. Wow. We spend 100 billion on Trident, right, annually.
Right.
And we're asking for 12 billion.
Yeah.
That's what could be saved
Mm.
if we plowed that into suicide prevention, suicide postvention, suicide intervention.
And the thing is, you need to say as well, it's not just about the people that, of course, the worst manifestation of this suicide crisis is the people that end up taking their lives. But there's also, there's also all the people that attempt that that never. I remember speaking to a guy who said he made an attempt on his life. It didn't work. He got up the next day and he went to work, and nobody ever knew anything about it. He sat with his colleagues, talked with his colleagues. Nobody would have known anything about it. It's all the people that have attempted. It's all the people that are having the thoughts and feelings about it. It's all the people that are
who are self-injuring as well.
Self-injuring, the slow suicides, the things like addiction and
all of that.
eating disorders, all of that stuff. People that are caring or worried about somebody. It's so I think it's not something that's just over there. It's something that is
it's pervasive. It's all around us.
Exactly. Exactly.
We know that 1 million people a year are bereaved or affected by suicide in this country. We know that. That's just in 1 year. So we know going into a crowd, going to a football match, going wherever. We know we're touching people, we're connecting with people who've been bereaved and affected, and yet it's not there. It's the elephant in the room. We're not talking about this, and we need to be talking about this. I'm going to change this because we're going to come to the end soon. I love having you on. I know it's only the second time, but I've met you numerous times now. I've travelled as far as London to come and see you, you know? But my question's this, and you can't include last night's results. When was the last?
Oh my God. Oh my God.
When was the last time you cried?
That's a great question. I will tell you like a football related story about, I can't remember. I don't know that this was the last time I cried, but I remember once just thinking about the process of emotional regulation, of like the need to be able to regulate. Stressful things are happening to us all of the time. We're feeling creatures, so we're having an emotional response, and we've got to try and regulate that. Now, I'm not someone, Yinka, I have like high kind of suppression habits, and I find it very difficult to cry. Not, sometimes I want to cry. I feel like it's going to be better for me if I did. And it's like something doesn't work anymore, and I'll get like a really bad headache. But football for me can be an amazing, it's like football can step into that. There's like a gap in me where I'm feeling the emotions and I want to express them. And football can sometimes be the bridge between the two. And I remember really, really vividly something very stressful had happened in my family in the morning. And I was very on edge about it and worried. And then Liverpool were playing Newcastle. We were at St. James's Park, and it was in that period where we were chasing City, and we've got to win every single game. And I think Virgil van Dijk got sent off, so we were playing with 10 men. And I remember thinking, Inga, in my head, I was like, we're fucked. And then I'm thinking about this stressful thing that's going on in my family, and I'm like, fucking life is fucking awful. Fuck. This is all horrendous. And then Darwin Núñez got 2 goals, 2 unbelievable goals, and I fucking cried, Junker. I cried watching it, and I'm not crying because Darwin's scored the goal. I'm crying about that thing that's happened this morning that I thought I didn't know how to express, and then football gave me the vehicle to release it, and it was such a vivid, magical moment. So praise be to Núñez for that intervention, which I really, needed at the time. And it always, Yinka, it never ceases to give me goosebumps, like watching Anfield, listening to You'll Never Walk Alone, which, I mean, in the work that I do is the most kind of haunting.
It's anthemic, isn't it?
Yeah. The end of the storm, all of that stuff that it's so emotional for me. So for me, yeah, football can be it can really help with regulating the emotions. The downside is it is difficult when your team are doing shit. I know we've got to be sensitive because Tim's on the call and his team is doing even more shit than our team.
Let's not do that. We might need a session of me later. Let's not even go there on that one. Tim's just put in there, what? Darwin Núñez cost 65 million for the bit of a
yeah.
We've mentioned it. Don't worry about that. Susie, when are you going to write a book? You've done some phenomenal research, and the last time I asked you that was in Liverpool, and you did the exact same thing and started smiling. But the work that you've done is phenomenal.
Yinka, I am thinking about it more because I feel that, particularly writing this paper about childhood and thinking about the role of attachment and how, for me, that all links into how we learn what to do with our distress.
Yes.
I really struggle, Yinka. When I'm distressed, I really struggle. I don't have good blueprints in terms of understanding what to do with it.
Okay.
And in the absence of that is when I feel the emergence of suicide. in myself. So I feel that I think it's I think the time is coming up to think about that seriously, in order, because you can, this is what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way. And I think I said this at the beginning, or actually maybe I didn't. I came into this work because people I loved were struggling to stay in existence, and we went many years trying to find help, and it was fucking desperate. You know, I really felt we were left to drown as a family, and I had to put my pain somewhere about that experience, and like the pain of watching someone that you love be in so much distress, feeling powerless and helpless around it. And so I came into this work on a kind of mission to better understand suicide, so that I could give that information back to people like me, people like my loved ones, people that are the ordinary people kind of living this reality, better information for them to make sense of what's going on for them, so that they can hopefully then make different decisions about what they want to do with their pain. So for me, that's always been like the core responsibility of the work. And I feel that as my understanding has become more in focus, I'm probably more now ready to communicate that more fully through something like a book. But I need to get an income first of all, Yinka, because at the moment I am.
I hear you. I get it.
Bless you, though.
I get it. Susie Bennett, Dr. Susie Bennett, excellence as always. Thank you for
Bless you, Yinka.
coming on the Hurt Locker. And that's a wrap, Tim. The Hurt Locker is a safe space for our guests to openly share their mental health experiences. If you have been affected by any of the content in this recording, then please reach out for support. If it is an emergency, dial 999. If you would like to talk to somebody today, then please call the Samaritans on 116 123. Stay safe. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Hurt Locker. Please give us a rating or share with another listener. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at The Hurt Locker Pod.